Thank you again, Andrea, for providing us with that really terrific overview of the WTO and reminding us of what's happening in Geneva every day to help keep trade going. So thank you again for that. I want to invite anyone who might still be looking for a seat who's just joined us to please feel free to make your way over here. There are still plenty of seats if you're looking for one. I'd like to also next invite our panelists to come up and join me on the stage here for our first panel session. This includes perspectives from the United States, Canada, and Mexico on the state of North American trade and the state of integration here in the region. David Gantz is our first panelist I'll introduce, who's joining us via Zoom today. He is the Will Clayton Fellow for Trade and International Economics at the Baker Institute at Rice University. He's also Professor of Law Emeritus at the University of Arizona. David has literally written the book on the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement. His latest book is titled An Introduction to the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, Understanding the New NAFTA. Eric Miller, come on up, Eric, is president of Rideau Potomac Strategy Group in Washington, D.C., a consultancy that advises public and private sector clients on a range of trade, regulatory, business, technology, and geopolitical matters. He's also held government positions in Canada, as well as at the Inter-American Development Bank and the Business Council of Canada. Kenneth Ramos is a partner at AGON, a Mexican consulting firm that specializes in competition, regulatory affairs, and international trade. Prior to joining AGON, Ken served as Mexico's chief negotiator for the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement. And finally, our moderator, Ken Levinson. Ken is CEO of the Washington International Trade Association and Foundation, and Ken is also a member of the Yeutter Institute Advisory Council. Thank you all. Ken, I'll let you take it from here.
Good morning. Thanks for having us here today. Thank you, Jill and JC, on putting together today's great program. Congratulations on the great progress you've made with the Institute, especially over the past 2.5 years when we haven't been able to meet generally in person. I know you've been having more meetings here in Lincoln, but for those of us around the country who haven't been able to travel as much, really great to be back. JC, good luck in your next gig. You are amazing, and I don't know if everyone will know that JC's going to be leaving, but you are awesome, and we really are grateful for everything you do. Thanks as well to the support of Christina Bach-Yeutter, who's the guiding light for a lot of the work that the Advisory Council does and the work of the Institute. So thanks to all of them. As well, an honor to follow my dear friend Andrea Durkin, who always does such a great job, and we are, those of us in the trade community are delighted that you are in your new-ish role in the last 9 months at USTR. Great to have your hand on the steering the ship of WTO for the United States. Really glad to have you there. We have a great panel today to discuss the state of trade in North America, a story that starts in the 1980s and continues right until today. We're going full 2022 with the panel today, with David Gantz joining us virtually and Kenneth and Eric here with us in person. As Jill already gave you brief titles, but you have speaker biographies that you can link to using the QR code on your sheet that you got today, so we can dispense with lengthier introductions. I'm delighted to be welcomed on the stage by my dear friend Ken Ramos, who is Mexico's lead negotiator of the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement that replaced the NAFTA. Ken is now a partner at the public policy firm AGON. Eric Miller, president of Rideau, Potomac Strategy Group, and a former Canadian diplomat. And joining us virtually, as we said, David Gantz, fellow at the Baker Institute, law professor emeritus at the University of Arizona, and author of the book, Understanding the New NAFTA. So delighted to have all of you here today. We're going to start by kind of going back a little bit in history. David, would you like to kick us off by giving a bit of political and policy context for the original North American Free Trade Agreement, which came into force in January 1994, and maybe recount for us how Americans viewed NAFTA when President Trump came into office in 2017?
Certainly, Ken. Thank you very much for the opportunity to do this. I regret that I'm not this person, but I'll do my best otherwise. Well, first of all, I think it's important to keep in mind that North American economic integration, particularly in the auto sector, goes back to 1965. when the U.S. and Canada signed the Auto Products Agreement. The next major step, as you suggested earlier, 1986, Mexico joined the GATT and started major market opening. Probably the real key, though, was 1988, when the U.S. and Canada concluded a free trade agreement that entered into force. 1989, Mexico essentially said, we'd like to be a participant as well. 1991 and 92, the U.S. and Mexico, then joined by Canada, negotiated the NAFTA actually over a very relatively short period of time. The agreement went into force in 1994 and existed until July 1, 2020, when it was replaced by the USMCA. By 2009, pretty much all originating goods, except a few agricultural products like milk products with Canada and used cars with Mexico, were trading duty-free. What's also interesting is that from 2008 to 2016, pretty much every U.S. president or candidate criticized NAFTA, some very, very heavily. Some of you remember Ross Perot's giant sucking sound, but most of them, certainly including Obama and Trump, but also Ms. Clinton as well, promised, if elected, to either revise or repeal the agreement. But it fell to Mr. Trump to reflect what I think was probably fairly broad views, both in Congress and in the public, that NAFTA needed to at least be fixed, if not eliminated entirely, which was Mr. Trump's original objective. And after condemning it as the worst trade agreement ever negotiated, he and his colleagues, particularly USTR Robert Lighthizer, actually managed to renegotiate and modernize the agreement. On the other side of the border, in 2018, during the presidential elections there, Mexican now President Lopez Obrador was very critical of NAFTA as well during the campaign, but ultimately he accepted it. So you have a situation where at least in two of the three countries, there was a great deal of skepticism at all levels of NAFTA. I don't think that was shared in Canada, but certainly this is an agreement that has created controversy essentially from the beginning.
Thank you, David, for that. I think that's a little bit of history. For those of you who are college students, you may not remember all the debates about the NAFTA, but I know some folks, a lot of folks in this room do remember a lot of the conversation about NAFTA going back even to the 1992 presidential election. And as you were remembering, Ross Perot and his giant sucking sound. Eric, turning to you, maybe you can provide some perspectives on how Canada viewed the NAFTA, and I guess going back to 88, the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement, which was originally, I guess, what was amended with the NAFTA and built on. And maybe tell us what the goals were for your Canadian friends for the renegotiation.
Sure. So Canada is a small-ish open economy. It needs global trade. It needs global investment. There's a vast store of resources in Canada, and there's not enough capital to develop it. So you needed that integration. Now, David mentioned about the Canada-US Auto Pact and so on, but a key moment occurred in the early 1980s when the global economy went into a major recession, and Canada said, how are we going to be competitive for the future? So this led to the decision to pursue what was really the first major bilateral free trade agreement globally and became the model for many, many other agreements that followed. And Canada had its debate in the 1988 federal election that said, should we do this free trade thing? And the voters came back and said, yes, we should do this free trade thing. So when NAFTA came along, it was, okay, so now we get to add Mexico as a market. And then we get to add Chile as a market. And then you go on further. And now you're at the point where Canada is the only G7 country to have a free trade agreement with every other G7 country. So the European Union, Japan, it's a member of the CPTPP. Prime Minister Trudeau actually put the CP on CPTPP because we need longer acronyms, not shorter acronyms, evidently. And so there is a basic consensus in Canada about the importance of global trade and the importance of being integrated into world markets. You've even seen this extend to the question of immigration, where the government announced earlier this week that they will significantly increase the number of immigrants which will be admitted to Canada. Because again, big country, lots of resources, small capital base, small population base. And so they have done a very good job in explaining to the population that you need to have connectivity to global markets. This is something that Nebraska farmers, for example, would understand every day, but it's something that is broadly shared. So the sort of rancorous debates that occurred here in around the NAFTA are not something you get there. And so the Canadian objective when it came to the renegotiation was save what you have and try to make changes around the margins to make things better. And that's what was done.
So, going to pivot now to our friend from Mexico. Ken was actually part of the original negotiation of the NAFTA, was the lead negotiator for for Mexico for the renegotiation of the NAFTA. So you have a unique perspective, Ken, on the agreement from the Mexican perspective. Do you think NAFTA achieved its original goals? And what were Mexico's goals coming into the negotiation in 2017?
Well, thank you very much, Ken, Eric, everybody, and particularly to Jill and the Institute for the invitation to come and share some viewpoints on the NAFTA and the importance of the USMCA. Hopefully, we can shed some light into how it actually impacts, businesses in Nebraska, especially when we're talking about agriculture, agro-industrial trade, and many different areas where there's a strong relationship and trade between Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. So basically, I think it's important to understand that the NAFTA really changed the economic structure of Mexico. It changed its economic paradigm. We went from being one of the most closed economies in the world, implementing these mechanisms of import substitution. In other words, trying to consume everything you produce and having very high tariffs versus the rest of the world. And as was mentioned, beginning in the mid-1980s with our entry into the GATT, we began this process of trade liberalization that was really consolidated with our most important trade agreement, which is the NAFTA, which is one of the first ones that we signed. Excuse me. Nowadays, we have 14 trade agreements with 50 countries, which taken together encompass approximately 70% of world GDP. And Mexico is one of the world's largest exporters. So it really changed the economic paradigm in Mexico. There was a lot of concern when NAFTA was originally negotiated in Mexico. You have to understand, especially in the agricultural sector, this was the first time that a developing nation was opening up completely every product that is traded in manufacturing, in trade and services was very much liberalized with a developed country. So Mexican agriculture was going up against the most advanced agriculture in the world, and there was a lot of concerns. But you fast forward as to what actually happened, and of course the numbers are outstanding in terms of trade between Mexico and the US, and also with Canada multiplying by 5, 6, and even 9 times with Canada, between Mexico and Canada trade. And in agriculture in particular, we went from exporting or overall trade with the U.S. of around $4 billion before the NAFTA came into effect to approximately $65 billion last year. So you see an enormous growth based on the complementarity of both agricultural productive vocations, so to speak, of the countries. And so there was a great increase both in trade and investment. Mexico used to receive approximately $2 billion a year in foreign direct investment. That figure at the end of the last administration was around $36 billion per year. So it really changed the way Mexico engages with the world and the structure of our economy. And going into the USMCA, I think Mexico and Canada shared a view that we should build upon 25 years of successful free trade between the three nations. Of course, there were trade irritants that needed to be resolved, and that's why one of the priorities for Mexico was to maintain and improve the dispute settlement mechanisms, which the Trump administration wanted to eliminate completely within the agreement. So we were able to maintain that. But most importantly, the goal was to preserve free trade, basically not have backtracking, go back to managed trade, TRQs, any non-tariff barriers had to be eliminated and not be created, not create new elements there. And that was difficult with the U.S. administration precisely because the Trump administration wanted to change the agreement completely and focus on eliminating the trade deficit with Mexico. There was this idea of instituting managed trade in agriculture, in automotive, in textiles, in a bunch of products, and we were able to avoid that. So we preserved free trade, we maintained the dispute settlement mechanism, and most importantly, we modernized the agreement. So 12 new chapters were added, which include rules, trade rules, on key elements that are essential to today's global economy, such as digital trade, which back in the early 90s would have sounded like science fiction, right? And all the advances in information technologies, in energy, in environmental technology, all of these elements helped shape this new agreement. So basically, it was modernized, and not just in the disciplines that already existed, we added new chapters, and also we try to make trade more fair and inclusive. So areas such as labor and the environment that were under the NAFTA just side agreements that did not have the same weight as the rest of the chapters and that did not have strong dispute settlement provisions are now fully included in the agreement. So that's going to help make the agreement more inclusive to all of the sectors and the people that work on international trade activity. So we see it definitely as a very positive agreement. Of course, I may be biased.
No, I think Ken, I think you share a bias that many people in the room maybe share, that they think it was successful in many ways, despite some of the rhetoric that's around it. And I want to turn to David. David, before we get into kind of the state of play with USMCA right now, I want to ask you your views on what what Ken and Eric said. Do you feel like NAFTA achieved its goals, bringing Mexico into the global economy, helping continue its transition into the global economy, and stabilizing relations with our southern neighbor in particular?
Yes, I think as a general rule, it did a good job of that. Obviously, there's some gaps. Some of the subsistence farmers were hurt, particularly in the southern part of Mexico, but it helped Mexico, I think, move into at least a mid-level developing country situation. And I think, frankly, it helped to support the transition from a questionable democracy to one that actually has worked pretty well over the last couple of decades. And I think obviously it's an ongoing process, and the jury is still out on USMCA. But overall, I think it made a great deal of potentially produced a great deal of benefit. Wages did not increase as much as some would have liked to have seen, and there's still gaps in some parts of the Mexican economy. But if you look back now almost 30 years, the difference is absolutely striking.
I think that's an important context, David, for as we kind of pivot into the next part of this conversation. If we having this conversation in the context of thinking of NAFTA as a net positive, not following kind of the rhetorical barbs that were thrown at it for the last 30 years, that were in many ways reflective of concerns about the changing American economy, but the changes in Mexico are pretty profound as well, and the integration with Canada and the North has been very profound as well, especially if you are near the border and see all the transit of products and manufacturing and the supply chains moving back and forth across the U.S. Canadian and U.S. Mexican borders. So, David, the USMCA went into effect July 1st, 2020, so we're a couple of years into it. How do you think it is working to achieve the goals that President Trump had for its renegotiation? And how is it working relative to NAFTA, which is an important question? Do you think it's been an improvement in the state of trade relations?
Two complicated questions. First of all, as Ken mentioned earlier, Mr. Trump was concerned about the U.S.-Mexico trade deficit, just as he was concerned about the U.S.-China trade deficit, and I don't think it had a great deal. It certainly didn't seem to help that very much, which is not surprising. I think one area where it is clear where he wanted change was that he and his staff wanted to see more investment, at least new investment in the U.S. and less in foreign countries, including Mexico, particularly, I think, but not entirely in the auto industry. And basically, the USMCA rules of origin are designed to make it easier for producers of vehicles and components to make a higher percentage of the vehicles in the U.S. than in Mexico or in Canada, for that matter. 75% now is the local regional content, and basically most of those policies have been continued without any reduction by the Biden administration with its Buy American, Invest American, Employ Americans policies, and in a sense they are really following up on the Trump objectives, obviously with a lot of federal and state subsidies in the EV area. And you have a situation in Mexico where a negative investment climate is probably encouraging investment in the U.S. and Canada as well. I think there are a number of areas where the changes are really very substantial. I tend to feel that the auto industry changes are at best are neutral, but in my view, we desperately needed better treatment of labor and environmental issues, and we have that in the new agreement. We badly needed better dispute settlement between governments. We have that in the agreement. The agreement was negotiated in 91 and 92. It badly needed modernization in all areas such as e-commerce, digital trade, restrictions on data localization, state-owned enterprises, regulatory procedures, and a whole host of others, as was mentioned, with all those new chapters. And I think the Obama administration thought it was going to do this indirectly through the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but we withdrew from that during the Trump administration, and it certainly isn't coming back during Biden. So basically, for North America, USMCA is what we have, and I think potentially it will meet probably most of the goals that I think all three countries would like to see occur.
Thank you. There's a lot to follow up on regarding the current agreement. We'll get to some of those things. But before we do, Eric, North American integration, I just keep using that phrase because I know how important that is, especially to Canada. How do you think that the NAFTA and now USMCA have helped Canada achieve its both regional goals and global goals? And we can then maybe get into some of the more thorny issues that have been sticklers for the U.S. and Canada especially.
Yeah. So, as I said before, fundamentally, Canada is a trading nation, and this is a cornerstone agreement. And so, to have a set of rules with your largest trading partners is really, really important. And so, on a baseline fundamental level, that is something that has been really important. Obviously, there were major issues for Canada. Canada produces about 2 million units of automotive vehicles per year, and so the changes on the USMCA rules of origin, which were incredibly significant, are something that are crucially important. But one of the things that's happening right now that is going to necessitate a rethinking of all of this is we are transitioning to the electric vehicle, and the rules of origin in the USMCA agreement were written for the internal combustion engine. So you don't need a lot of the same components in the vehicle, in an electric vehicle, than you have there. And so fundamentally, I think there is going to be a shift. If I were Mexico, I'd be quite concerned about that, because with the renationalization of the electricity sector and with some of the hostility toward electric vehicles, that's something that's been a challenge. And for Canada, Canada has been early on the electric vehicle bandwagon, providing a lot of research support, direct subsidies, and things of that nature. But ultimately, products need to get sold into the market. And the biggest market for vehicles, about 17 million units a year, is in the United States. And so we've had since the 60s this integrated auto provision, and to have USMCA first safeguard that regime is something that's important. But ultimately, what I worry about is we're going to get to a point where nobody is going to be able to meet the content requirements in the rules of origin. And then there are little pesky issues like, how does the Inflation Reduction Act, which mandate 100% of content of certain components be either originating in the U.S. or a free trade partner by 2029, and 80% of the minerals, how does that reconcile itself with the USMCA rules of origin? So perhaps in the 6-year review and what follows, we're going to be in a situation where that will be renegotiated. And for Canada, which was a direct major contributor to the restructuring of General Motors and Chrysler in 2008, 2009, it's something that will be crucially important because the auto sector in Ontario accounts for over 500,000 jobs and increasingly research and development jobs in other parts of the country. And so, again, USMCA is the cornerstone piece that maintains all of this.
So I was going to go to Kenneth with some other topics, but I think I want to dig in a little bit further here on the vehicles issue. Obviously, it's a very conspicuous sector. It's a sector that people pay attention to, a sector that you can see looking out in your parking lot, and you can look at where the cars, you can see the different companies that are reflected. You're not always sure where the parts and where the cars are manufactured just by looking at them, but obviously they were front and center in the renegotiation. Automobiles, as Eric was just talking about, the U.S. has passed several new pieces of legislation in the last year and a half that deal with infrastructure, that deal with climate change, and then also deal with auto manufacturing and rules of origin. How is any of that viewed in Mexico, and how did you view the auto issues as coming into the negotiation? Where are we with that today?
Well, as you mentioned, Ken, the automotive provisions of the USMCA were perhaps the most difficult and the central elements of the discussion, precisely because the U.S. was focusing on how to reduce a trade deficit with Mexico, and in automotive trade, that's where you find the majority of the trade deficit that the United States has with Mexico. So part of the solution or the proposal by the U.S. was to tighten the rules, to increase the required level of the value content requirements, but also the percentage of parts that are manufactured in the U.S. The original proposal of the U.S. was to set the salaries of the automotive sector in Mexico through the FTA, through the trade agreement. So many of these things that were impossible to do and that would have been negative for the sectors, the auto sector of all three countries, we were able to get rid of. Basically, in the negotiation, what we said, along with Canada, was if we make the rules of origin requirements too strict for all three countries, what's going to wind up happening is that investment is not going to go into the U.S. It's going to leave North America altogether. It's going to go to China. It's going to go to Eastern Europe and other places. So we struck a balance there where, as was mentioned, 75% regional value content with a bunch of other rules related to the percentage of steel that has to be purchased in the region, labor value content. In other words, a certain percentage of the vehicle has to come from regions that pay high salaries or $16 or higher. So all of these rules make the trade within the auto sector, yes, more complex, but at the same time, it does create an incentive for auto parts manufacturers within the three countries to have more of a stake or a participation in the auto sector. Companies that are located in China or Eastern Europe or other parts of the world now know that they have to locate their facilities in North America in order to enter the auto market, because they can no longer do it just exporting their final goods from other regions. So that in and of itself is a good deal. It strikes a balance and guarantees a stronger auto trade in North America. However, right now we are involved in a trade dispute with the United States. Canada joined that dispute, so there's a panel going on right now, a discussion that should be resolved probably by December of this year, which is very important, because the U.S. is sort of interpreting incorrectly what you need to do to comply with the value content requirements of the agreement. In other words, it makes it harder, it moves the goalposts so that it's harder for auto assemblers in Mexico to be able to obtain the zero tariff preference when exporting to the U.S., and the same with Canada. Why is this important? Because it's a central part of the agreement, because the balance of everything else hinges on key elements not being distorted, such as the automotive discussion. And I will go further when we're talking about North American integration. Recently, the U.S. Secretary of State and the Department of Commerce Secretary came to Mexico and made a proposal to Mexico and also to Canada to really create a production platform for the future, to attract a lot of these inputs that now the US, Canada, and Mexico depend a lot on Asia, such as semiconductors, but also lithium batteries, high-tech medical equipment, etc. So the proposal is to build a production perimeter, so to speak, in North America for the sectors of the future, which will be fueled definitely by attracting investment in semiconductors, developing electrical vehicles, etc. And all this sounds very good. It's something that Mexico should accept. The problem is that trade liberalization has to go hand in hand with domestic policies that are conducive to attract investment, to produce a good, positive business environment. And there's a lot of domestic policies in Mexico, Eric alluded to those, in terms of energy, for example, that are going backwards, are looking to use more fuel oil, coal in the production of electricity, to try to renationalize, as was said, and give the power to the state monopoly. So all of that has to be modified in Mexico for us to really be able to take advantage of this possibility of further integration in North America, and certainly to take the next step in terms of developing the auto sector towards electrical vehicles.
So we've got about 20 minutes left. We want to talk a little bit about the future. We also want to have time for questions from the audience. But I just want to circle back in this section we're in talking about the current USMCA and talking about, David, are there some things that you think we should be looking at that maybe aren't working the way we intended, or maybe you can already see are going to need to be improvements that we're looking at when we do this next review?
Well, the next review, I guess, is due in about 4 years, and it's very hard to predict who's going to be president in the U.S., who's going to be president in Mexico. When that happens, I think Ken has already properly emphasized the fact that we have problems with the auto rules of origin if we're really going to be able to maintain an integrated North American auto market as we shift into electric vehicles and electric vehicle batteries, and I think that will change. In other areas, I think perhaps the problem is not so much, excuse me, USMCA per se, as it is policies, particularly in Mexico with the anti-investment climate, and setting up a situation where not only are people worried about electricity and petroleum takings, but if you're an American company and you have carbon neutral obligations that you have stated, and you have to use dirty fuel oil as your generating power, and you don't have 24/7 reliability, and it's expensive, it's a huge disincentive entirely apart from the basic issues there. And I think that has to be corrected, but that is really a domestic issue. It's not really a USMCA issue. I think on the U.S. side, I am concerned about the extent of the Buy American approach of the current administration, which isn't, of course, that different from the Trump administration, because I think it in some respects it conflicts with the idea of North American integration. I don't have a list yet of what ought to be looked at in 2026 with the first review. I think the fact that we have that opportunity has enormous potential, assuming, of course, that the three governments can agree on what they want to do. And I'm guessing that the one thing that they're going to have to do is to figure out better ways of dealing with electric vehicle battery rules of origin, because that's where this most important industry is going.
So I don't want to get too down the rabbit hole of electric vehicles, but it has been a front and center issue in the trade policy conversation in Washington and globally in the last few weeks. I want to circle back, Ken, with you just a second. When we were prepping a little for this session, you mentioned you've been focusing a lot on some of the agriculture issues that are currently kind of causing some issues with the USMCA. So just a little bit, maybe you want to fill in the room here a little bit about some of the things that have been going on just, I think, in the last few weeks on some of these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a key topic. As I mentioned at the beginning, really ag trade within North America is the biggest success story of the NAFTA, and it should continue to be the case with the USMCA, because we are preserving free trade, but we're also introducing through the USMCA disciplines that enhance transparency on how sanitary and phytosanitary measures are used. In other words, you protect SPS measures, you guarantee the health of animal and plant health in the three countries, but you ensure that these measures are not used for protectionist purposes, to create barriers. We also added a provision in the Ag chapter on cooperation on biotech, agriculture biotechnology. And this is very important. So what we have seen over the last 2 years really is protectionist pressures and protectionist wins on both sides of the border, really. On the U.S. side, the congressional delegations of Florida, California are constantly trying to facilitate the imposition of anti-dumping or countervailing duties against Mexican fruits and vegetables that have gained enormous market share in the U.S. That's part of the complementarity I was talking about before. Mexico can provide fruits and vegetables year-round to the United States, which the U.S. cannot do. And by the same token, Mexico imports enormous amounts of grains, oilseeds, and meat products. And so those competitive advantages are working well within the USMCA environment. Trouble is that in addition to these sort of protectionist pressures in the U.S., in Mexico, we have seen the cabinet of President López Obrador becoming more radical, more ideological when it comes to being opposed to GMOs. There is a decree out there since 2020 that establishes that over time there will be a phase out of imports of GMO corn into Mexico, which is truly, I hate to use the word, but it's suicidal because Mexico is importing between 17 and 19 million tons of yellow corn from the United States, which goes to the livestock sector, which goes to agro-industrial processes. And so with the situation that we have internationally, with the prices of commodities going through the roof, the cost of shipping, the problems that we've heard, for example, in the drought in Mississippi that is holding up, the barges that are bringing soybeans, grains, and other products, this is not the time to head into the direction of protectionism. That's something that we're facing right now. There is a lot of concern. I do believe there are violations there that Mexico is engaging in when it talks about, curtailing the access to not just corn, but also cottonseed, soybeans, etc. And so that can become a big problem. What's the solution? To engage Mexico, and I'm talking about the U.S. government, and I'm surprised it hasn't done so as of yet, to ask for consultations under the USMCA on agriculture, just like they did on energy, and that's beginning to move the needle a bit in Mexico, but just the mere threat of a possible dispute settlement case in agriculture can also get things going. There's a strong allies in the trade ministry, in the agriculture ministry of Mexico, but there's a whole area on environment and health within the cabinet that really wants to shut down biotech trade with the U.S., and that would be very, very detrimental both to the U.S. and to Mexico.
Thanks, Kenneth, for that update. I think that it matters a lot to a lot of the people here in the room. Sticking just in the agriculture space, Eric, one of the issues, the thorny issues in the negotiation was about dairy. I think you were mentioning that the first softwood lumber dispute with the U.S. and Canada goes back more than a couple hundred years, perhaps?
It's the first Congress of 1789.
And so I remember it was sort of a joke, who was going to get to work on that issue in the U.S. government on the softwood lumber, because it was seen as sort of a penalty for having done bad things at some point, that you'd have to work on softwood lumber. Have we seen any resolution or any progress on either the dairy issues or the softwood lumber issues?
So this goes in many ways to the limits of trade agreements. And in some ways we've been in this mode now of trying to preserve what was done in the 90s, and we have to ask the question about what are the limits. And so the first softwood lumber agreement goes to 1789 in the modern era. The first round of the modern era was 1982. And I think it's fair to say that this issue is not likely to be resolved through trade law, by lawyers, or even by trade agreements, because there's a fundamental question, which is the U.S. produces 70% of the softwood lumber it consumes, and those that produce that softwood lumber like duties to raise prices to pad profits. But you see now a perverse situation where Canada's share of the imported U.S. lumber market is declining, and you are importing more from Germany, from New Zealand. And so you ask, from an environmental perspective, does this make sense to put things on a barge from New Zealand and bring it to the United States, or should we put it on a train like the ones that are going by here, and distribute it from within North America. And so that is an example. When you look at energy, you have Canada sitting on an enormous store of oil, natural gas, renewables, yet it is more and more difficult to sell energy products. But the Biden administration goes to Venezuela and say, oh, Venezuela, would you please produce more? Why are we not producing more in Alberta and Saskatchewan and in Quebec on hydropower? And so fundamentally, we look at these issues. We look at dairy, which is also an issue which is unlikely to be resolved because since the Canadian Dairy Commission Act of 1966, and then with some innovations in the early 70s, you've had a system where Canada essentially says we will give domestic producers very high incomes and you will pay high prices, but we agree not to import or export a lot of that dairy. So you essentially isolate yourself. But the question is, we keep fighting over these issues, but what's the real game in North American cooperation? Why is it that you're looking to Venezuela and not to Canada? Why is it that we are not asking the question of what we can do together to make our economies stronger? And so what this comes down to fundamentally is it better to work with neighbors in a shared purpose, or is it better to work in a scattershot mode where the President of the United States goes to Saudi Arabia and fist bumps Mohammed bin Salman, and then they turn around and say, we're going to raise energy prices before the midterm elections, so people here have to pay $5 a gallon at the gas station. If we focused on what we had as our strengths in North America, in critical minerals, in agriculture, in energy, there is nothing that we cannot do. We can lead the world and be the most secure and prosperous region. But this comes back to not looking at USMCA as a mere collection of trade disputes, but something that we are going to have to underpin our future prosperity. And this is what trade is fundamentally all about. And so there are some things that will always be with us. I do not anticipate liberalization of the US sugar sector anytime soon. But are we going to let the best become the enemy of the good, especially when that good can be really, really great on a global scale?
So it almost feels like we should say thank you and drop our mic and leave the stage, but we're not going to do that. We're going to try to take some questions from the audience. You guys were really quiet in the last session, so I'm hoping to see a few more hands. We should have planted some questions perhaps, but do we have any questions out here from the audience? I heard some chuckles about sugar. Any of you care about EVs? Mexican agriculture? All right, we got one.
So, Eric, following up on yours then, if you think we should work more with Canada on the energy sector and hardwoods, et cetera, what does Canada need to do to make that happen? And then what does the U.S. need to do?
So part of the challenge that Canada has is that it's been a bit schizophrenic about its own energy sector. Interestingly, Canada actually has a national price on carbon. It's administered provincially, but everywhere in Canada has a price on carbon. But since the Ukraine war, there has been a reevaluation of the understanding of where energy comes from. I mean, they've done surveys of people and they ask, where does energy come from? And the top number one answer is the wall, like the wall plug. And so there needs to be a bit of an illusion busting that we do not need natural gas, that we do not need oil, that we do not need other sources. We are in a transition, but a transition is a long process. And so much like the Europeans who are now freezing because they did not want to think for years about being reliant on natural gas, the government of Canada needs to fully embrace its energy advantages. And in doing that, the US and Canada could come to a good understanding around how to work together, how do we get energy to markets? Because we already have an integrated grid within the US and Canada, which is an enormous advantage. So you add clean hydropower, for example, from Quebec, that fuels New England, and that's something that is a good advantage. But we have to have this dialogue about where we're getting our energy from and what we're going to do with it. And Canada has many people who want to sell that energy, but the government of Canada does need to do some work as well on getting things permitted, getting them moved forward more quickly. We're just sitting on this advantage, and what's really frustrating is, it's kind of like watching the football game where you've got really great field position and you decide to run on third down when it's like, 3rd and 9. It's like, that's not going to work out too well. So we have to actually rethink what we're doing, and that's going to be something that is important to work together. But again, this needs to be about dialogue, not just about fights over milk and lumber.
So, I'm reminded, Eric, I heard somebody say this, talking about our energy policy, our environmental policy, our trade policy, and our industrial policy. It's like people going around saying 2 + 2 = banana. Like, it literally makes no sense, and it's not coherent. And you look at people like, why are we... None of what you're saying on the one hand makes sense on the other hand. Even in Germany, for example, the Green Party was founded on the premise that nuclear energy is dangerous and bad. They now have this huge shortage or concern about supplies of natural gas when the cheapest, cleanest long-term solution for energy is nuclear power. And Germany actually buys a lot of nuclear power from France, but won't build their own nuclear power plants because if there's a nuclear disaster in Germany, it's not going to be a problem in France or vice versa. So we're not the only ones without rational plans. At least
Remember, energy comes from the wall.
Right. Energy comes from the wall. So, yeah, at least in Germany, they are now going to keep nuclear plants they had planned to close open, thank goodness. But just, we only have actually now about 4 or 5 minutes left. Any other questions, or do we just go to like a little wrap-up question with our panel? Oh, here we got one over here. And another one on that side. Great, we got 1 and 1.
Thank you. Jay Rempe with Nebraska Farm Bureau. I'm just curious, in part of the discussion, you talked about the underlying support or not support for freer trade. You mentioned Canada and the support there by the people, the vote many years ago. What's your sense in the respective countries right now that just the average citizen and their support of globalization and free trade?
We're going to go get all three of you to answer this. But why don't we, David, did you hear the question?
Yes, I heard the question.
Why don't you give us a stab at that?
Well, I think it depends on where you are. We're in Nebraska, and I think the support for free trade in Nebraska is very strong. And most of the Midwest and anywhere else where you have agricultural exports who have benefited from U.S. market opening measures, beginning with the time of Clayton Yeutter in USTR. I think other parts of the country, it's very different. I think certainly the Trump administration and the Biden administration generally have not been in favor of free trade. I think they overemphasize the opposition, but as our friend from Canada indicated, the U.S., probably Mexico as well, have done a very poor job of making the case for freer trade, and I think we're dealing with that now. And at the moment, I'm very pessimistic. I don't think the U.S. will be negotiating free trade agreements in the foreseeable future, or participating in creating new trade rules.
We get an optimistic note out of Eric, perhaps?
So in Canada, the support's pretty strong. In Mexico, I mean, Ken could clarify, my sense from afar is it's tepid. And in the U.S., I think the only way to rebuild some foundation for free trade is to figure out what the China policy is. Because I think if we look honestly, China was the great disruptor to the global trading system. And the discussions about trade and globalization and all of that became conflated with the rise of China and now the conflict with China. And so once there is some understanding of what the U.S. and China will do on trade, and particularly what the U.S. will do vis-a-vis China on trade, that perhaps lays a foundation for a different view.
Kenneth?
Thank you very much. Well, it's been interesting. In Mexico, there's been a big shift. Recently, they did a very comprehensive poll where they asked the question, do you believe the USMCA is good for Mexico and should free trade continue? And over 75% of the respondents said yes. This contrasted with what happened just, 10 or 15 or even 30 years ago when the agreement was negotiated, where there was a lot of fear, a lot of opposition, fear of competition, a lot of established monopolies that did not want to yield economic power. So in Mexico, we have the advantage of time on our hands. In other words, 30 years of successful free trade that has actually yielded strong results in Mexico. The problem is a little bit of what you were mentioning, inconsistent domestic policies. The only two trips that President López Obrador, this is a government that sympathizes with Nicaragua, Venezuela, Bolivia, has been very leftist throughout his whole life, the president, yet he pushed actively for the approval of USMCA in a Morena-controlled Congress, Senate. That's Morena is the ruling party of the president, and it was approved 114 votes in favor and 2 against. So despite all these leftist leanings, all this nationalism on energy, protectionism on agriculture, the president, his trips that he made international were to visit President Trump and President Biden in Washington, and he signaled that the USMCA was a key element for the economic future of Mexico. So that's where we stand. We have to have a match between, the promotion of trade agreements that Mexico is doing and negotiating worldwide with actual domestic policies that help us take advantage of these trade agreements. But we have had a big shift in public opinion over the last few years, precisely because of the results that have made Mexico one of the world's top exporters.
Fantastic, fantastic. Matthew, did you want to ask a quick question? Let's keep it short if we can, though.
Real quick. David and Ken, if you could comment on Eric's last comment, don't let the disputes kill all the good of the agreement. What happens if the U.S. loses the auto dispute and doesn't comply? And should the countries be seeking maybe to avoid use of formal dispute settlement in these high-profile disputes, at least in the early years of the USMCA?
David, you want to take a quick stab at that?
Well, of course, my hope would be that the U.S. would comply, and I think that the odds are pretty good that they will. They've gone through the process, and I think the auto industry in North America is so important, particularly with the shift to EVs, that it would be quite foolhardy for the U.S. to allow the wedge to go any further. So I'm optimistic just because it seems so logical that if they lose, which I suspect they will comply.
Well, I would say that we shouldn't be overly worried or scared that there are trade disputes occurring in the USMCA, even in important sectors. That's precisely why you have a dispute settlement mechanism built into the USMCA, precisely to allow for disputes, small or very large, whether it's on energy, automotive, obviously big topics, big sectors, for those to be resolved in a parallel track without affecting the rest of the viability of the agreement. So I think it's actually a positive fact that, as opposed to the NAFTA, where we had a lot of problems in forming the panels, in agreeing on how the dispute settlement would work, in the first 2 years of the USMCA, you have seen panels be formed quickly and come to resolutions quickly. On dairy, solar panels, we're going to have the solution on the issue of automotive, hopefully by December. So I think countries should use the mechanism when it needs to be used. I am also hopeful, as David said, that the U.S. will comply because it's clear that they are in violation of the USMCA rules. If they don't comply, of course, there's a possibility of Canada and Mexico imposing trade sanctions, increasing tariffs. We, by the same token, are on the other side of the table in the energy consultations. That could lead to a major panel and possible trade retaliation or sanctions by the U.S. that could be upwards of $10 billion. So it's key to use the mechanism to use it as a form of dialogue at a time of dispute resolution before you go to a panel. But if you go to a panel and you lose, you have to comply because that gives credibility to the system. That applies to Mexico, Canada, and the U.S.
I think that's a great way for us to think about closing this panel and continuing this discussion. Is these disputes are also opportunities to talk and to find solutions, to continue to find solutions. And I know we have the review coming up, is it in 2026? And I think we should be thinking about now how we set up towards that discussion in 2026, which is built into the agreement. So essentially just one little thing, that the agreement says every 6 years, right, of the existence of the USMCA, that the parties will sit back down and look to modernize the agreement, something that wasn't part of the original NAFTA and is a template that maybe other agreements that could also be updated and modernized could look at. So with that, thank our panel. And turn it over to you, Joe.